Well, I'm here with a really great panel today. We have had each of these individuals on my radio program, A Neighbor's Choice, and they each have a unique angle on markets and the economy and how wealth works. But I thought it would be a great opportunity to bring these three individuals on together for a roundtable about gold, money, and the future of both. What's happening? What's the future of gold? What's the future of money? And just kind of an introduction to this space. I'm 31 years old, and I know there's a lot of folks in my age group that watch my program and programs like this. And there's a lot of questions going on right now this year, especially with all the ramp up of political intervention in the economy. So we're going to try to set some foundational ideas on the table, give people an introduction to this topic of gold, why it's important. So first, I have Jeff Deist, who's a frequent guest of my program. He's the president of the Mises Institute, which is a foremost group for studying Austrian economics in the world. They've been a big advocate of understanding how markets work. We also have Keith Weiner, who's the president of Monetary Metals. He's a big, passionate believer in gold and precious metals, and also how markets operate most effectively with a free market approach. And then we have James Dale Davidson, who joins me, and he is the author of The Sovereign Individual, which is considered to be like a Bible for a lot of folks in Silicon Valley, because it was written in the 90s and predicted a lot of the great things that have come to pass in the world of the digital cryptocurrency space and so forth. So he's also the founder of strategicinvestment.com, which is a forecast and prediction website. So thanks for joining me, guys.
Pleasure to be here.
Thanks for having us.
Yeah. Well, let's start with Jeff. I wanted to ask you, when did you first get interested in the topic of gold?
Wow, that's an interesting question. One thing Ronald Reagan did when he campaigned in 1980 was he promised to look into potentially restoring a gold standard in the United States, or at least studying the question. And that was one of his later unfulfilled campaign promises. But nonetheless, he did commission a gold standard committee. It's shortly thereafter, 1981. And my later boss, then Congressman Ron Paul, sat on that committee and wrote what turned out to be the minority report for that. So when I managed to meet Ron in the late 80s, early 90s, through him, I became interested in the topic. And there's still a lot of fascinating stuff you can read in that Reagan report, on that Gold Commission report. It still reads absolutely prescient today. And it's always been a topic for those of us who are wary of government overreach, because the purse strings are at the core of everything government does. And if you look at the 20th century and all of its terrible wars and all of its terrible entitlement programs and all of its terrible destruction of families, underlying it all is the ability of Western governments to produce money at will. And so I think not that it necessarily needs to, but it tends to dovetail with a libertarian outlook, an interest in gold.
Very interesting. How about you, Keith? When did you first get interested in gold?
So I've been sort of generally aware of gold in the Austrian school as a student of objectivism since around 1986. But my first career was as a software developer, and so from the time that I was full-time, working around 1990, so the year after you were born, I think, if I did the math right, through founding my company in 94, selling my company to Nortel Networks in August 19th, 2008. I basically had my nose to the grindstone, and I wasn't real politically active. I wasn't studying economics. I was just focused on building a software company, which is just a lot of challenges in a lot of ways. Having had my transaction right before everything went over the edge, which I didn't know at the time, I had an uneasy feeling about the market in the summer of 2008, but I had no idea what was going to come. And then that happened to be the 90 days. So I said to my wife when the transaction closed, I don't want to make any major financial moves for 90 days. I just want to let this settle in and then we'll figure out what we want to do. That happened to be almost perfectly lined up with the 90 days of the worst of the crash. So I'm watching this, first kind of feeling all bemused. It kind of felt surreal to me that here I sold my company, I'm sitting on 100% cash. It's in a couple of safe banks, too big to fail banks. I have the most, so September 2nd, or less than 2 weeks after the transaction, the CEO of Nortel goes out to Wall Street and says the wheels are coming off. Announces that he's firing the CTO and a couple of other C-level execs. The CTO was the guy who wanted to acquire my company. He's the one who had the vision for it. Laid off 15% of the company. Then in October, another 10% layoff, I think. It was just absolutely brutal. And I'm looking at this saying, I have the most stable job in the company. You couldn't fire me. I mean, they've gone to quite great lengths to have a retention agreement with me because the technology they had just bought, and the purpose of that acquisition was the technology, would not have any value to them if you fired me. So, at first I just felt very amused by the whole thing, but as things became more and more serious, I started to study markets and economics to try to figure out what's the root of all this. Eventually coming to gold, eventually coming to kind of a different monetary theory, realizing that gold, we can all quibble and debate as to what it's going to look like, but gold is going to play a role in the monetary system of the future post-dollar. I think there's really no debate of the dollar's coming to its sunset. We can debate as to how and exactly when, but I mean, that's going to happen. Gold's going to play a role and probably the dominant role. And therefore I wanted my next venture, I felt far too young to retire, wanted my next venture to be doing something that was part of the solution. And so starting in 2009, I became very keenly interested in all things gold, founded Monetary Metals in 2012 with a unique mandate not to buy and sell gold and wait for its price to go up, but to get gold to circulate. My theory comes down to there has to be an interest rate in gold. So we exist to make it possible for people to earn interest on their gold, to pay interest on gold. So that's my story in a nutshell.
Well, very good. So both of you guys, looks like you had your encounters with gold in the 80s. How about you, James? When did you get into gold?
Well, I began to be interested in gold ages ago when I was just a tyke, well before you were born. You were just a gleam in your father's eye, let's say. I spoke in 1972 at the Republican convention that prevailed on the platform committee to put in a provision to legalize gold holdings by Americans, which had been prohibited as from the New Deal when Roosevelt came in. And then I began to actually earnestly invest in gold. I started a gold mining company in Peru in 1993, which is still a public company. We think we have about 10 million ounces of gold in that project called Oro Peru. And later in the 90s, I started a company in Turkey with $800,000. It was pooled together by me and my principal partner, Dick Moores, who is a famous geologist who's found $4 or $5 billion plus deposits. And that company became worth $3.5 billion on the Toronto Stock Exchange in 2012, I believe, 2011. So I've had a big interest in gold. It's still one of my major investments. I have an interest in a private gold mine in Arizona. And thank God.
My backyard.
We're going to make millions and millions out of it, if not more. So I'm quite excited about gold. I think it's, politically, it's very important because, as was mentioned earlier, the big problem in Western societies is that governments have the ability to create credit at will. And credit is a close substitute for money, not really money. If you look at what the QE2, QE1, QE3, and the present pandemic Q, whatever this would be called, 4 or infinite, you have the impression that they're printing money. They're not really printing money. They're creating reserves for the banking system, which could create money if they had the balls to do it. And they also had customers who were ready to borrow money. But there's a big risk premium on borrowing money, and that risk premium exceeds the threshold of interest, so that there has not been a huge expansion of the money supply downstream from the creation of these reserves. And I think it's all very deflationary. I have for a long time thought that Emerson was right, Ralph Waldo that is, who said that you pay for everything you get. If you don't pay that price, you get not what you look for, but something else. Mm-hmm. And I think we're getting to the stage where we're going to have a huge deflationary collapse because we've created a short position against paper money or fiat money of hundreds of billions of all these debts in dollars around the world. These are an effective short position against the dollar. And I think that everybody thinks that inflation is what is going to drive up the value of gold. But if you look back in history, gold has risen in deflation as well as inflation. And the more deflationary the crisis, the greater the need for gold, because then you really do want to have an asset which is not somebody else's liability. And that's what gold is. It's an asset that is not somebody else's liability. You don't have to read anybody's balance sheet to know that you have something when you have gold in your pocket. So that's my approximate take on it.
Just to add on to that, I define deflation as a forcible contraction of credit, basically defaults. And so in a deflationary environment, people want to turn to gold because who wants to be a creditor when all the debtors are defaulting?
That's exactly right.
Then you end up with, you think you have a piece of paper that's worth something and it turns out it's worth nothing. If you have a piece of gold, then you know that it can't be worth nothing.
Well, it reminds me of that. It reminds me of that old saying from the 80s. That saying, in the 1980s, an ounce of gold could buy you a toga, some sandals, and a belt that you could use at a frat party, like Animal House. Today, that 1 ounce of gold can buy you that same toga plus a congressman, So that's the real value of gold. Doesn't change, does it?
Yeah. Well, it's interesting. If you ever look at the extreme eccentric facts of history, you find that the richest man who ever lived probably was King Solomon. And he was rich because he had a tremendous stack of gold. One of my faraway ancestors was a Byzantine emperor, or he thought he was a Roman emperor. He didn't think he was a Byzantine. He'd never heard of the Byzantines, right? But he had a tremendous amount of gold, so he was probably the 10th richest man in history, with billions and billions and billions in today's dollars. And the people who had, like Marco Polo's report on the Emperor of China, the Great Khan, who could buy all these things by just printing up money and using it as legal tender, because you couldn't refuse the Emperor of China. You'd have your head chopped off. So that worked to a degree, but none of us is ever going to have the position of being able to impose on others by threat of beheading that they accept fiat money. So even with all that fiat money power, the Great Khan was not one of the richest men in history. So you have to have had gold in most cases to even count in that group.
Well, Jeff, that brings me to my next question for you guys, which is, there's a popular conception that gold is a rich man's game. That's something that's some kind of esoteric thing that the uber elite old people get into. What does that have to do for the future? What does that have to do for the common man? So let's step back a bit in history. How did humans get into gold as a species that you're aware of? Like, how did we get into this? Was this foisted upon us by kings arbitrarily because it was in their interest, or did humans kind of voluntarily desire gold to be used as this medium?
Well, no, it wasn't foisted. It arose as a commodity, I think, because it had certain properties that made it good for trading and for maintaining value and keeping it. And of course, kings did come along and try to avail themselves of the power of gold by putting their stamp on it, and then sometimes altering the weight, the amount of gold that was actually contained in a coin, and diluting it, but yet keeping the same face value on it. That's something that governments still do today. It's called seigniorage. So, you know, gold has been money for a long, long time. And as I listen to this conversation, I mean, that's what drives governments crazy, is just the enduring feature of gold. There's never been a time, at least in recorded human history, where gold went to zero, where it was worth nothing. So we can talk about the merits and demerits of a physical metal and its beauty or its industrial uses or whatever. We can have this separate conversation with the Bitcoin people, and I'm sympathetic to that conversation as to the, you know, the advantages of digital transmittal and all this and that. But at the end of the day, gold never goes to zero. So we don't know what the future holds, but we do know whether that future happens to be highly deflationary, which I would tend to agree with, very scary, or highly inflationary. Either way, uncertainty generally has, you know, forces people into holding more cash on their balance sheet. And just since the COVID crisis of February, March this year, we have seen that Americans have a lot more cash. This is the natural tendency of people to have more sort of what they consider the most liquid asset during a crisis. So gold is not per se cash in the United States. That's unfortunate. It should be, but it's just a quarter step away from that. And so it's not just a rich man's game. James mentioned the Turks earlier. The Turks are crazy about gold. It's a cultural manifestation of wealth for them. The Indians are crazy about physical gold. In Asian culture, you know, owning physical gold is a much bigger thing than the United States. So there's still a demand for it. If you look at where physical gold has moved, especially in the second half, in the now 21st century, and especially since the crisis of 2008, a lot of gold has flown from west to east. In other words, Eastern central banks and Eastern consumers want more and more of it. And as a matter of fact, central banks in general hold more of it on their balance sheets than they did 5 or 10 years ago. So I'm not smart enough to tell you why gold endures, but it does. And the fact that it endures in and of itself, gives it tremendous value, tremendous worth as a hedge against uncertainty, whether that uncertainty is inflationary or deflationary. So everything governments do with fiat currencies and everything central bankers do to dismiss gold and treat it as an outdated, barbarous relic, and to poo-poo concerns about their own currencies and all that, gold is still there as a canary in the coal mine, basically pointing out the lie. And so I think that's why it's politically disfavored, but it's been around for thousands of years with a monetary use, and they just can't get rid of it. And to me, that's its most important quality.
So Nassim Taleb would say it has a little bit of anti-fragility to it, right? It's endured
Absolutely.
over the years. Keith,
Absolutely.
What about Keith? Let's turn to you. You've talked a little bit about Neanderthals and the dreams they had about gold, huh? On my program before. Is there something kind of subjective or arbitrary about how humans went to look at gold? Did they like the shimmer of it as a little ape? They give it to another ape and they decided, hey, I like that? Or what was going on in that beginning stages?
There's something very universal that I assume was true for maybe not Neanderthals. A friend of mine wrote a book where he argued the Neanderthals were accumulating gold 13,000 years ago out of the stream beds in Europe. And he has arguments as to why he believes that, and he's spoken to anthropologists about it. But there's something about gold, when you hold pure gold, it's so incredibly heavy. It's much heavier than it has any right to be. And then, it's shiny, it's a unique color, all those things. And when somebody's held it and then you hold a coin made of any other metal, you can immediately see gold has I'll call it a tangible reality to it that nothing else, comes close. Obviously, platinum has basically slightly higher density. Tungsten is almost exactly the same density, but those weren't known or discovered, until relatively recent times. What I was going to say is gold, the money of rich people is gold, the money of the people. I really think it's the money of the people, because I think that people always need and look for an alternative. So if you're looking for a truck and you go to Chevy, and then, the terms or the price or the color on that Chevy Silverado isn't to your liking, you go to the Ford dealership and you get an F-150. If you go to Burger King and you say, these fries look gross, you go to McDonald's. But if you go to the banking system and you say, ew, the banks are going to pay me 0.01% in order to take unknown and unknowable risks, with exposure to a balance sheet that's tens of trillions of dollars worth of derivatives that all the smart guys in the room say net out and everything's fine. Maybe I would like to take my marbles home as the alternative to being a creditor to a bank. And the brilliance, and I have to preface this by saying evil, the brilliance of FDR's move of making gold illegal to US citizens in 1933 was he disenfranchised Americans, took away any teeth to their time preference, eliminated any ability for there to be a so-called bond vigilante, because now you have no choice. To own $1 is to be a creditor, and you can only choose whether you want to be a creditor to the bank, creditor to the Treasury. If you're big enough, you can be a creditor to the Fed itself, through a Fed account, or if you own paper cash, you're a creditor to the Fed. But they've taken away the right to leave the Chevy dealership and go to Ford. They've taken away the option to say, well, I'm going to take my gold and withdraw it and then leave the system. Now, since 1975, thanks to the efforts of a number of people, certainly including Jim Blanchard, you can now own gold, but they've given it a price risk. So now you buy gold today, I haven't seen the price today, but in recent days, $1,960, something like that. There's a risk it could be $1,860 next week. And for the most conservative of saver, that price risk may or may not be acceptable, depending on their time frame when they anticipate the need for liquidity. But in a gold standard, owning the physical metal is not a price risk, because gold is the unit in which all prices are denominated. And so that is absolutely a feature needed by the people, by the common man. The really rich guy has recourse and has all kinds of other alternatives. If you don't want a cash balance in a bank, there's other things. You can buy real estate, and you can buy private equity. There are other things that may be a way better deal than cash. It's the person working for wages who is trapped in the system and who's screwed more than anybody else by the dollar system.
James, anything to add to that, or what's your take? How did humans get into gold? Why is it endured? Is it just for the elite?
Well, no, it's not just for the elite. I'd like to address that point more directly. I think, we know all the stories about the Midas touch and the kings of Lydia and how they coined gold and made it into currency and so forth. But I had, when I was younger, a close relationship with Murray Rothbard, and he used to emphasize the importance of the gold standard in raising the pay of the common man. Because if you worked for $1 and the gold standard made it mildly deflationary, 5 years from then, the dollar that you made and saved was worth more than the dollar you first made. Mm-hmm. And this was a great boon to people who were trying to work their way up in life. It gave you more capital as time passed, because you weren't being eroded. Right now, we're being eroded. If you earn $1, you put it in the bank, it's like having your wealth in a vat of open alcohol. Whatever it's worth is, as we just heard, is a guess. And it takes an exceedingly well-informed person to make more than a lucky guess about which way the currencies are going to move and when the value is going to go up or down. And this sort of prices out people who are working with their hands, or working, like the many people whose jobs have been lost in the service industry, the people who change the bedpans, the people who are in the hospitals, the people who provide the care that society needs, that wash the dishes and clean the floors and schools and so forth. These people are not in a position to have the leisure to read, to even listen to this program or read books and up-to-date financial information, to subscribe to Bloomberg, to figure out what they should be doing with their money. And I would say that unless you're George Soros or Warren Buffett, if you're trying to figure out what to do with your money based on your own thinking, you're in a loser's game, because George Soros could do that. And he broke the Bank of England, as we know. Warren Buffett has made billions and billions, but the number of Warren Buffetts in the world is very limited. So unless you're Warren Buffett, I think you really need something like the gold standard to give you a boost, to give extra value to the money that you can save. And that's why it's really not for the Warren Buffetts of the world, who've never liked gold until recently. It's for the average guy.
It's interesting how everything about capitalism has the worst PR in the world, right? Free markets, that's for greedy people, that's for consumerism, but it's actually the opposite. And there you go with gold. Gold gets this PR image of being rich bankers counting their gold, which I guess central banks do own a lot of gold, and we can get into that. But what you guys have all illustrated here is it's actually empowering the common man, which goes to a point Peter Thiel and others make the point all the time that we, since the 70s, we've had stagnant wages. And I think maybe there's a link between that and Nixon, right? Getting us off the last vestige of a gold standard and introducing this unlimited ability for the, government to, create credit out of thin air, to create all these laws and these labyrinthine regulatory complexes that have restricted the ability for people to grow wealth and to grow their wage as well, right?
Well, let me just follow up a little bit here on James's point. Yes, we've had stagnant wages at best. We might have actually worse than that, depending on how you run the numbers since the 70s. But here's the thing, is what separating the US dollar from gold did was it allowed government to produce dollars without having to tax people and therefore spend money it didn't have. So the result of this is that interest rates need to be pressed down, or else the federal government starts having a huge amount of debt service. So right now, interest rates vary on different treasury debt, depends on when it was issued and the term of it. But for the most part, interest on the national debt at the moment is pretty manageable. It's about $400 or $500 billion a year. It wouldn't take much, just historically average interest rates in that 5 to 8% range to make interest on the national debt the single biggest line item in the federal government budget. And that would make Congress very unhappy. They'd be spending more on interest than they are on so-called defense, on Social Security, on Medicare. So one of the perverse outcomes of our fiat money system is that interest rates went lower and lower and lower. So when we're talking about average people, and I agree entirely that if you're not Warren Buffett, if you're not someone who spends 60 hours a week studying markets, you're going to be in for a very, very rough ride trying to invest your money in equities or, God forbid, Forex or whatever you might want to do. You're going to have a very tough time. But here's what my grandparents and great-grandparents could do. They could simply save. They could simply be thrifty in their personal habits, put money in the bank, and get 8 or 10% on it in totally safe investments. They didn't have to go out and figure out and try to read about the next FANG stock. They didn't have to get into a REIT or something that some 25-year-old kid was trying to sell them as an investment advisor, right? They could just be thrifty and allow compounding interest to work its magic. And so when they got older and no longer had the physical ability to go out and earn income, they were fine. This is something that's been taken away from average people today because interest rates are so low. So that's why you have pension funds, and pension funds have a lot of metaphorical little old ladies in them as investors, literal old ladies. You have pension funds going out and having to buy Amazon or whatever stock they have. So one of the great tragedies, I think, of the United States in the second half of the 20th century, now 21st, is simply the loss of savings, the inability of the average person to keep up or exceed inflation just through simple thrift. So it's that argument alone, I think, weighs heavily in favor of gold because gold's a hedge against that.
Mm-hmm. Let me add to that, if I may, and I agree 100% that the little guy, the saver, is now basically given a terrible choice. It's the tiger or the tiger. But I want to look at wages for a minute. So in a rising interest rates, rising price environment, which we had in the 1960s, and boy, did we have it in the 1970s, the wage never really keeps up with inflation. People are going to their employers, getting wage increases. They do get raises, but the raises are always lagging the change in prices. And by the time you get the raise, it's almost but not quite keeping even with where things were a few months ago. And I was 12 years old in 1979, and I remember every week, as a family would go to the grocery store, every price of every item every week was higher and noticeably higher. And I think, looking back at it now, the official CPI was 12 or 13% or something like that. Looking at that and remembering my experience, that feels like that 13% understates it. So yeah, everybody got raises, but not enough, and always with a delay. And that's a feature if you read Janet Yellen's seminal paper, the one that all the left hails her as an expert in the economics of labor and monetary policy. The core of the whole thing is frivolous. She says, well, if workers feel that they're being not paid enough, then they're going to slow their work or maybe even sabotage the tools that their employers give them. So therefore, employers have to overpay them a bit, which means that because the budget to employ people is limited, you're going to employ fewer workers. And this is her explanation for structural unemployment, which is totally wrong, but that's a different story. So therefore, the solution is for the Fed to print more money, which will give the employers more money so you can have full employment. And yes, she does concede this is going to cause inflation, and eventually workers are going to demand a raise. However, you can get inside the workers are stupid, and you can get inside their decision loop. And so this will work for a while. Eventually they demand a wage, and the Fed is going to have to, repeat the cycle. That's kind of the core of her whole, paper. And you read this, and it's like, this is insane. So post 1981, we do not have an environment of rising interest rates, and we certainly don't have skyrocketing inflation. We have falling interest rates and either soft or even falling prices. I remember in 1983 buying a pair of Levi's 501 blue jeans for $50. And I encourage everybody to go Google and look at the price today. The last time I did that, it was like $37.50. So we're in an environment of soft prices, if not outright falling. The reasons why prices rise, and basically regulation and taxes, and falling interest rates. And this is an environment for the liquidation of labor and for downward pressure on wages. And the way to understand this is to think of, so I'm going to appeal to the concept of net present value. I'm going to assume everybody on this Zoom is familiar with that, but for the audience, if you have a future stream of cash flows, such as a bond or even dividends on a stock, you can say, okay, well, next year I get $1 today of dividend on the stock. Next year I get $1. The year after that I get $1, and so forth, assuming you had clarity as to how much it was going to pay. Well, there's a value that you ascribe to that in the present, and that's called net present value. And to get to net present value, you have to discount each and every one of those future payments using some discount rate or discount factor. And it turns out that the market uses the market rate of interest as the discount rate. And that makes any stream of cash flows comparable to any other, and you can compare it to the interest rate on a bond. So every time the interest rate falls, the net present value of all future cash payments goes up. And for something that's a perpetual stream, then it turns out that every halving of the interest rate doubles the net present value. So this is pretty well understood. This is Finance 101. Where my radical idea comes in is that a wage can be considered a cash flow, a cash stream that is a perpetuity. And therefore the net present value of a wage doubles. That is, the burden to the employer feels like it doubles with every halving of the interest rate, which means workers had better double their productivity or be rendered redundant. And as the interest rate is falling, we see this frenetic work environment where people are expected to do more and more for less and less. And so in the 1970s, you had everything's rising. Employers had the luxury of being slow and lazy. And the time from buying raw materials to shipping finished product, could be months. And it was a very lazy environment, and they could afford to give raises, and they magnanimously granted raises, of course, with a lag. In the 1980s through present, it becomes more and more frenetic. Nobody's making the margins anymore. If you go to your employer and ask for a wage, chances are they're not making the margins to pay it. Anyways, nobody has any choices anymore. So we're on this treadmill. Think of every drop in the interest rate as turning up the speed on the treadmill. We're obliged to run faster and faster to stay in place. That's what the falling wage is doing to those who are working for wages. While at the same time, those whose compensation is tied to asset prices, fund managers, bankers, CEOs, and of course, anybody who can borrow dirt cheap money to speculate on asset prices, their wealth and their income is rising exponentially. So we see this widening gulf between the wealth of the 1% and the income of the wage earners. And of course, the left says, oh, this is a feature of so-called late stage capitalism. And it's all a function of our central planner, the Fed, not of capitalism at all.
I'd like to weigh in with just a thought, going back to the question of whether Nixon's repudiation of the gold reserve system touched off a big problem for the wage earners. And I think it did, but I think there was a transmission element to this, which came out of the fact that by moving away from the gold standard, we moved to an oil standard. We had a deal with the Saudis that had its origins with Roosevelt's World War II deal with the king, that we would defend the Saudis in exchange for them keeping the price of oil priced in dollars. And when I think it was Bill Simon went to Saudi Arabia after Nixon pulled the plug on the gold reserves system, they were concerned that they were going to be getting worthless dollars for their oil. And they raised the price of oil quite considerably. And that shock, I think, was sort of the uppercut that knocked the lower middle class out of the game. And really, in most counties of the United States, income has not risen since 1971. It's still where it was then in terms of real spending power. And you can look at these wasted cities, these little tiny towns that used to have one or two factories that are now just smears of rust or hollowed out buildings that have fallen down, and occasionally a shopping center which was built up and is now being emptied because that stage in history has gone past. And I think it has to do a lot with the fact that the energy cost of energy has been rising up to a point where prosperity is no longer the residual, but we have a decline in growth, a decline in real growth, which means that only the most nimble and people with financial capital can continue to gain income or gain wealth as the system unfolds. We look at this mystery that Wall Street keeps going up. Well, we saw with the pandemic subsidies that quickly stocks went back to a new high because there's so much money coming in from the Fed to backstop prices of bonds and and stocks. And we have, it's not a mystery, and that's, I think, one of the reasons why Robinhood became such a big success, because a lot of smaller players saw, well, we got $1,200 from the government for nothing. Now, what if we put this money into the stock market? We're liable to make more money. We'll be, instead of being left behind by the increase in asset prices, we can join the party. And they did, and millions of people opened Robinhood accounts, and most of the stock that they invested in went up. So this is a phenomenon that I think is very complex. It has lots of interacting dynamics. But the basic thing is, it's all a game that shouldn't be played. If we had honest money, if we were still on the gold standard and government had to pay its way instead of doing what it does today, we have all these policies and programs that don't pay their way. And this creates great problems. It goes back to Bismarck when he started Social Security and unemployment compensation in Germany. He spoke of having a modest, controlled version of socialism. That's what he was trying to do. The thing is that it metastasizes and it gets bigger and less modest and less controlled. And we've got all these welfare programs that seem to make sense and seem to work in terms of arithmetic in the days after World War II, when almost everybody else's industrial capacity had been obliterated, and Americans were the biggest producers of automobiles, televisions, everything. We were the best, and we could afford to pay our workers dramatically because there was no competition. The competition drives down prices and drives down wages. And now we have a world of billions of people, and all these people want to live a decent life to some extent. And we can't really compete with the way things are going in the United States with all these people who will work practically for nothing. And it isn't just that it's a labor cost issue, but there are a lot of other issues. I think one of the reasons that China became so big is that we exported production to China, which could be done without violating our clean air standards. You know, if you look at what happened with production, the Chinese opened up all these coal mines. Practically every day they were opening a new coal mine and a coal-powered generating facility, which was basically disintermediating US environmental standards. So that's what happened, really.
Almost a form of arbitrage.
Yes.
So I guess my question then for all of you guys, you can just jump in, whoever now, is how do we get the people back to gold? You know, what's the path? Do we need governments to step in and create a gold standard? I mean, I asked people, I solicited questions online to people, and you know, Howard says Jim Rickards thinks local currencies will remain, but the strategic drawing rights will become the new global reserve currency and will incorporate gold. I mean, there's one idea. How do we get people? Do we get governments to go back to a gold standard, or do we? You know, Ron Paul said just legalize competing currencies. I remember that's what he would say. What you guys? Well, you guys
David,
think?
I'll say this much: you can't impose it. You just have to allow it. I have no problem with allowing the U.S. government and its central bank, working in tandem with its treasury to continue printing dollars. Let people decide if they want to use dollars as currency. That's fine by me, but just don't punish people for using other forms of payment, including for their taxes. So this is the big problem, of course, is that government treats exchanges using gold as basically capital gains or capital losses, and not just at the normal rate, but at a special collectibles rate. So it's obviously not worthwhile for most people to transact or what effectively becomes bartering in gold. So, we have all kinds of electronic and digital means at our disposal now where gold could simply sit as an asset in a private vault or in a private bank, and it could be exchanged digitally, electronically. We don't necessarily need actual paper receipts, to exchange hands as payment between people. So we don't have any technological issues here. We just have an issue of will. And I think a lot of what James was just describing, we call that the financialization of the economy. I think, where if you've seen the movie The Big Short, you go back to 2006, 2007, you had strippers buying 5 condos without any documentation of their income, that sort of thing. That's something that gold would have prevented. And so I think our job is to give people an alternative. And the first thing we got to do is make them aware of this and make them think about it, because they, a lot of America really has been hollowed out. And do people really want to take their $1,200 stimulus check and open a Robinhood account and try to figure out which stock to buy? I mean, that's rational behavior in a sense in the current environment. And it's so important and so desperate that we change that. And maybe we have to do that in guerrilla ways. And I would argue that Keith's company, which is something I've studied a bit and admire very much, is a form of a guerrilla approach to changing this.
Well, Keith, let's get into your company, but I want to ask this question from Tony. He asks, are people really barred from using gold for economic transactions? How do legal tender laws work? Would a businessman be jailed for demanding gold for payment? So just kind of think of those things as we unpack these.
What the legal tender law does is it says if you tender dollars, that is, if you have a debt and you offer to pay dollars, that's all the court is going to enforce. So, if there's a debt and the debtor, says, here's the dollars, then the court's going to say, okay, Mr. Creditor, you got paid in full. What else do you expect? Now, it's possible to work around that. Gold clauses were legalized sometime in 1975 or thereafter. So when they legalized the ownership of gold, they did legalize gold clauses as well. So between sophisticated parties, you can certainly have a gold liability that's enforceable. But what I was going to say is the problem with all these gold payment systems, and I've said this to James Turk, I've said this to Roy Seabag, I've said this to a lot of other people that, Douglas Jackson, a lot of other people that were working on or have worked on gold payment systems, is that I think a lot of people would be happy to be paid in gold, but very few people want to pay out their gold. And this is it's not exactly Gresham's law, but it's kind of a corollary to Gresham's law, that if I have a choice of paying you or paying a debt in paper that's going to be falling or gold that's not falling, I'll choose to pay it in paper. I'll keep the gold and pay out the paper. And so, gold, as long as there's no way to earn interest on it, gold is always going to remain for private hoarding only, no matter how much gold there is. So that's the other thing that comes up while we don't have enough gold. So I've researched how much gold there was in London at the time, at the peak of the gold standard, when London ran the world's monetary system and the world's commerce in the 1890s. They had about 160 tons of gold, according to the records. The state of Nevada annually produces 166 tons of gold. So one state produces more gold than was in London at the peak of the whole thing. It's not a quantity thing. It's a matter of earning interest. So there's a quote from Keynes that I think most gold people would be aware of. And it starts out saying, there's no surer way to overthrow the capitalist order. That one, and he's talking about debauching the money. Most people think he's talking about inflation because he says not 1 in a million can diagnose it. I don't think he was that dumb. I think everybody sees inflation. My recollection of the 1970s is everybody talked about inflation every day. It was on the nightly news 5 days a week. That was pretty obvious. But Keynes talks about engaging all the hidden forces of economics in favor of destruction. And I think about that all the time. And I think that, of course, today our word for hidden forces of economics is incentives. And so he came up with a very clever incentive mechanism. He said, drive the interest rate to zero, euthanize the rentier whom you consider to be a parasite that was useless, and overthrow capitalism ultimately. And I think about, and how do we do that? Well, if you're driving interest rates to zero, you're driving asset prices to infinity, and that's why nobody can diagnose the problem. Everybody loves a bull market. How can you say there's something wrong, Keith? Look, my stocks are up. My real estate is up. But I think the hidden forces of economics, the incentives, if you make it profitable to move to the gold standard, then naturally people want to do it because people like profits. And so I think it's in that sense, it's simple. There has to be an interest rate in gold, and then that will be the unlocking of the gates that allow the gold standard to move forward and people to move forward to the gold standard.
I would add to that the observation that Winston Churchill once made about Americans. He said, Americans will always do the right thing after they've exhausted every other alternative. And I think that was a very shrewd comment, and it still has a ring of truth to it. And my expectation is that we will end up with a gold type standard, a gold standard, possibly interfaced with something like Bitcoin, where you use sophisticated algorithms to use fractions of gold. I mean, if you look at the fact that you can buy products with Bitcoin right now, you're not even getting a single Bitcoin that's worth $12,000 or $13,000, depending on the day, but you're getting a tiny fraction of a Bitcoin. Now that Bitcoin could also refer to a deliverable in gold. There's no reason why it couldn't. And I think ultimately that will be a rescue out of the rubble. We're looking at, I think, a rapid deterioration of the economy that we knew. I had an economist who was a great mentor of mine and a friend, whose name was Mansur Olson, who wrote a book called The Logic of Collective Action and also The Rise and Decline of Nations. And he used to say that values reflect what used to pay. What used to pay. And we're still sniffing the perfume out of an empty bottle when we have civilization, we have families that are taught various values about how to behave. Be thrifty is probably something that your parents told you, but they may not have practiced it themselves. And being thrifty did pay a century and a half ago, or at least just some number of generations in the past. It probably doesn't pay as much today as it used to do. But when this big edifice of international economics reaches the stage of total collapse, and we've seen a pretty good preview of what total collapse would be with the pandemic reaction, which was itself aggravated by the decision of government to close everything down. So they destroyed the economy and then tried to rebuild it. We're seeing a rebuild that is not very convincing in my view. I think it's probably not going to work, that we're going to get a quick bounce back of some things, and then gradually it'll become apparent that you can't continue to have the government pay the salaries of all the airline employees. Those are things that don't work in the long run. If nobody wants to fly, airlines are going to go out of business, so they're going to be. Warren Buffett used to say that he thought the Wright brothers should have been shot down at Kitty Hawk because so much money had been lost in airline investment. But be that as it may, I think we're in a very difficult position. The whole thing is winding down. Exactly how it ends, nobody knows. But we've had a preview of it, and I think we came very close to the total collapse in 2008, and came very close to total collapse this year. And we're still working our way out of it. I think because the stock market is going up is not a sign that all the troubles are behind us. We have a difficult row to hoe, as they say. But life is good. Keep your fingers crossed. Somebody will come through it.
Well, James, what was that? 1998, you wrote that book, The Sovereign Individual, which people said you really nailed this prediction about a cryptocurrency, right? And you're saying we need to bring a crypto element in with gold to bring it back to the public? Is that what you're suggesting?
What I'm suggesting is that I think that when the fiat currency systems collapse, as they always do, this one is not going to be different than that. I mean, one of the great lies of all time is it's different this time, right? It's like the check is in the mail. That's another great lie. But someday this whole thing is, as Nixon's advisor Herb Stein used to say, if something can't go on forever, it will come to an end. And I don't think that this system is really well suited to go on forever. It's not going to. It's going to come to an end. When it does, something will take its place. When the Roman Empire collapsed, something took its place, but there was a huge drop in living standards. I think there may be a huge drop in living standards in this case. And a lot of people who depend on things that are undependable will suffer with it. If you're one of the few who has gold or silver, let's say, or even if you had lots of platinum, though I don't think that's going to be much of a factor, you will do better than the ones who are just hoping that there's going to be another $1,200 check coming your way out of an empty pocket.
Well, if things collapse, gentlemen, there's a commenter here asked, named Bruce, if things get really ugly, he's saying here, how would gold work versus firearms in a Mad Max future? Surely good weapons and ammo are a superior store of value and a hedge against being robbed of your shiny precious metals no one wants for food. So what's your response to that idea?
Let's kind of separate out two different issues here. Obviously, if some gang is coming to take your life and your food, then gold is not the appropriate tool for that situation. Better to have a gun than gold. But in terms of store of value, guns will obviously have value. There's no question about that. And ammo will have value. But guns and ammo are not money. And so just as money is not a solution when you need to defend your life against violence, weapons are not a solution when you need to transact business. And people always criticize gold and say you can't eat gold. That's right, gold is not for eating, and you can't use a steak dinner for buying something either. The steak dinners are not used for transactions. So keep each thing in its respective bucket, and say hopefully things don't get so bad that it just comes down to gang versus gang. Because in that case, we got a whole other heap of problems besides what's the greatest store of value.
Also, you can't eat Federal Reserve notes either unless you're a gerbil. So,
okay.
Well, David,
just to say you can't eat gold.
I mean, if the gold is really so worthless in a Mad Max scenario, then the marauding gang will just leave it behind after they ransack your house. I suspect they won't. I suspect that marauding gang will actually confiscate the gold and take it with them, and there's a reason why. And that's because, again, based on thousands of years in the past, that Mad Max gang probably thinks that it's going to have some value going forward. So I'm not, if someone says, well, a gun's better, why not both,
Matthew asks, how does someone with absolutely no idea how to invest in gold and precious metals get started? And I think there's a related question here, another one asked that kind of relates to this, where Chad was saying, is there evidence that the U.S. government is manipulating the price of gold via the Exchange Stabilization Fund created by the Gold Reserve Act of 1934? So the reason why I see those questions together is when you're just an average guy, you don't know anything about gold, but then you hear that it's manipulated. How do you even get started in this?
Well, that puts us back to that question about whether gold is for the benefit of the the elite or to the common man. And it shows here a common man puzzling over how to get involved in it. Whereas in 1890, when there was a gold standard, he didn't have to figure that out. It was all there for him. He was taking a free ride, as Murray Rothbard used to say. And it's too bad he can't do that now. But if we're going to be thinking investors or thinking citizens, we need to figure this out for ourselves now. So I think, you asked me what I would do. You didn't ask that, but I did. I can tell you, I got involved in buying up, doing a roll-up of defunct gold mines in the west of the United States. Why? Because where you find gold is where you used to find it. And that's, you know, it was there, so it's still there. And what we found, interestingly enough, we bought up 3 or 4 old mines in Arizona, and we found that sitting on the surface in the tailings, we had $35 million worth of gold that could be reprocessed with today's technology. So we're going to make money out of the scraps of 19th century mines. Now that is probably more sophisticated than the guy that's starting with nothing, looking at how to go ahead. He doesn't have a great geologist and a great metallurgist as partners. He won't be able to do that. But that's what I did.
So should people buy gold mine stocks or something like that?
Well, I think there's a leverage in that. I think that's a good way to get started into gold. And also they should go to gold coins and, you know.
Everybody should have half a dozen gold coins, you know, in the stock drawer, as it were, as just a starting point. Maybe arguably a bag of junk silver coins as well.
Yeah, I think that sounds right. So that's one thing. It's not rocket science. I mean, you don't need to get a PhD or study for weeks or years to figure out how to buy a bag of junk silver and call you and you'll sell him some gold coins, won't you?
We're not primarily involved in the buying and selling, but we certainly would encourage people to open an account at monetary-metals.com and start earning interest on it. But that's a whole different discussion.
Well, there are ways forward if you give it half a minute's attention.
Right.
Well, I just want to, do a little closing round here of just kind of landing the plane about where do you think the future lies with, again, kind of that overall thought of how do we chart a path to gold? Is it going to look like some kind of digital currency attached to gold? I've heard of different ideas about that. Is it going to take some kind of political reform for that kind of gold free market currency to arise? We've got these issues where people are being choked out of, Chase Bank, choked out of payment processors just because they're hanging out with the wrong people or create the wrong social media platform. So is in this context that we find ourselves, where we have this oligarchic financial industry and governments, and they're fighting tooth and nail to keep this Orwellian world that they need to keep their parasitical financial privileges going. And yet there are millions and millions and billions of people who are pushing back. They don't want to keep being predated. And they don't know why they're being predated. They don't know how to stop the predation. And you guys are saying gold has something to do with how to stop this predatorial system and how to empower people to take back their personal wealth. So we'll just have a little concluding thought there. Start with Jeff and go from there.
Well, that's a sobering way to put it. I think that was well put, but gold's a starting point, and holding it outside of the banking system, which is very much controlled by federal regulators, I think is key. And so if things get really bad in this country, we all hope they don't. We all hope that those $50 Levi's go to 35 and then 15, That's the only thing keeping us afloat, as far as I can see, is the natural deflationary tendency of markets, despite everything central banks especially do to inflate them constantly. you know, I think having an underground system that begins with gold is a way for people to, you know, show that they want freedom. They want monetary freedom. They want real money, and they don't want to be subjects of governments. They don't want special drawing rights from the IMF. They don't want, you know, a U.S. dollar with a central bank that's got a $10 trillion balance sheet. They want something real and lasting. And so, you know, everything government does and quasi-government central banks, everything they do is basically based on our willingness to tolerate it. So, you know, revolutions have tipping points, and oftentimes those tipping points are subtle, and oftentimes they're not that visible because they happen over a period of years. But if people get disgusted enough and frustrated enough, I think they'll start looking for alternatives, and gold's right there. It's not going away. And so I think we got to put our hope in that deflationary nature of economies.
Very good. Keith?
You know, my perspective is I spent 5 years trying to lobby at the state level, met a couple of congressmen at the federal level, and I've met with MPs and central bankers outside the US as well. And I've come to the conclusion that whatever the solution is going to be, that solution will not be that the legislature is going to pass a great gold law. I mean, I think at best, and there have been a number of states who've done it, including Arizona, that have repealed the capital gains tax on gold. So at least at the state level, you don't have that problem that if you buy a steak dinner and you pay in silver, that they say, well, what did you pay for that silver, and what's the silver worth now? And you have a capital gains tax bill, you know, right after you pay the restaurant bill. But I don't think it's going to be coming from governments. And so I think there's a very interesting model in Uber in that, you know, Uber started and said, okay, well, the taxi cartel makes for a miserable user experience and a more expensive ride than it should be. They didn't lobby for a better taxi cartel law. They just said, well, we're going to start, you know, letting people buy a ride using this whole new channel. Now, what they did was probably illegal in a lot of cities, and their strategy was to grow fast enough that by the time the taxi regulators would go after them, they'd be too big. There are too many customers that the customers would be screaming bloody murder if the regulators would try to take them down. And so they had one real fight in Austin where they were closed down for a few weeks, I think, before Austin was forced to back down. And I think, obviously, when it comes to money, you don't really want to mess with the regulators. The currency regulators and banking regulators and securities regulators are a heck of a lot more serious than the taxi regulators. And much more draconian things happen to you if you mess with them. But I think the bottom line is there are ways to start offering people alternatives that make rational sense, so, you know, appeal to people's self-interest. And, you know, if you do that and you know, develop that, then I think you can build a pathway to the gold standard, you know, by largely in the free market without much, if any, legislative change.
James?
Well, I think that the crux of the issue is the question, will this fiat system work and stand the test of time? My answer to that is no. And I refer to the great political philosopher Ringo Starr, who said, everything government touches turns to crap. And that's still true, and it's going to be true in the future. The question, I suppose, it really goes back to book 2 of The Decline of the West by Spengler, who claimed that we would have maybe another century of sort of pseudo-civilization before everything went to barbarism. I hope that we have at least the pseudo-civilization to accompany the collapse of current ways of doing things. But I do think that we're in the last innings of this whole system. We can see so many signs of disintegration and things falling apart. Part of it is cultural, but a large part of it is just pure economics. When things run out, we have to keep the fact that we're in this process of having a new secular trend around over indebtedness that used to take decades between these events, and now they're coming every decade. You know, we have this event today that we're living through. We had one in 2008. We had a previous collapse of the .com boom around the year 2000, 1999. The timing of these things is becoming compressed. And I think I would not be surprised if we have a really crucial collapse within a decade. You know, it just doesn't seem to work. It doesn't, they're buying, it's like going to a third world country and bribing the dictator. The difference between the prosperous third world countries and the ones that aren't prosperous is, in the prosperous ones, when the dictator was bribed, he stayed bribed. In the others, everything was a constant negotiation. You know, well, you paid me this much yesterday for this, right? Now, how much will you pay me today? Or they throw out the dictator every 2 days so that some new guy wants standing there with his hand open. It's not going to work. I mean, I'm pretty sure of that. And I hope that we can stay alert and mindful and be in the right place when the music stops, or at least not be in the wrong place.
Very good. It's been a pleasure talking to you all. And I want folks to remember, if you want to follow Jeff Deist organization, go to Mises.org. And if you want to follow Keith Weiner and what he's doing with Monetary Metals, the website is monetary-metals.com. And to keep up with James Dale Davidson and his email newsletter, go to strategicinvestment.com. So it's been a pleasure talking to you all. Thanks for participating.
Thanks, David.
Thanks, David.
Thank you.